All right, so if you think about early ACL rehab, that's really all about healing, right? Well, this middle phase, this is where the real work starts. We're talking about that critical window from about week 6 to 12 and even beyond, where you stop being just a patient and you start becoming an athlete again. So let's really dive in and figure out how to master this crucial phase.
Here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll talk about making that switch to multi-directional movement. Then, we'll get into mastering lateral mechanics. After that, we'll break down the logic of smart loading, build up that aerobic engine for conditioning, and finally, we'll put it all together into a practical 12-week blueprint. So, we've officially hit the mid-stage. This is the moment where we start putting away the therabands and the real implements come out. The focus totally shifts from just letting tissue heal to actually rebuilding true athletic qualities. We're talking strength, control, and the ability to handle some real load. And that brings us to our next big topic, mastering lateral movement. It's just so important to start rebuilding that multi-directional strength early on. And that all begins with moving sideways, working in what we call the frontal plane. Now, this quote here from clinician Tim Rollins, it's a bit of a game changer. It really pushes back against that old idea that you have to master running in a straight line before you can even think about moving sideways. His whole point? The more controlled reps you can get in early, the better and more confident that athlete is going to be when it's time to actually do these moves at speed. It just makes sense. And this chart here illustrates that idea perfectly. You see, you don't just jump straight into cutting and changing direction. No way. You start with something simple, like a static lateral lunge around week 6, just to build stability. Then you can bring in some dynamic movement, maybe some slides, some controlled drills. By week 10, you're layering in reactive shuffles, and then finally, that leap and land, which is just absolutely critical for learning to absorb those lateral forces. It's such a logical, smart build-up. So, throughout this whole progression, what's the most important thing? It's all about safety and quality. The movement has to come from the hips. You're pushing through that lateral hip. If you see any sign of that knee collapsing inward, what we call dynamic valgus, that's an immediate stop sign. Time to regress. We are always looking for good alignment and soft, controlled landings. That's how we protect the graft and build really robust movement patterns. Okay, so we've got the movement patterns down. The next logical step is to start adding some weight, right? We're moving beyond just body weight. So how do we do that safely and effectively? How do we build real strength without causing any setbacks? Well, we've actually got several different levers we can pull here. We can play with volume, that's your sets, reps, and load, which is really the main driver for muscle growth early on. We can crank up the intensity, which is the actual weight on the bar. We can mess with the tempo, like, say, a slow 3-second lowering phase, to build incredible control. And of course, we can progressively increase the range of motion. Each one of these lets us challenge the body in a new way, making sure progress is steady, but totally under control. And this is probably the most important question any clinician faces. You want to push the athlete so they can adapt. But how do you know when you've pushed a little too far? When is it actually time to take a step back? Here's a really clear 4-step framework to help. First off, if you see their strength drop on a key test compared to what they've been doing lately, that's a red flag. Second, if swelling kicks up and doesn't go down. Third, if either of those things stick around for more than a couple of sessions. And finally, if their movement quality just starts to look sloppy. Any one of these should make you think, okay, time to pull back on the load or complexity. Now let's talk about something that gets overlooked all the time in rehab programs that are just so focused on strength. Conditioning. I mean, think about it. An athlete can have the strongest knee on the planet, but if they can't last a full game, they're not ready to get back out there. What's so great about this table is how it shows you the evolution of cardio. You can actually start conditioning right from day one with something like an upper body ergometer. Then, as the knee gets stronger, you can move to a stationary bike, then an elliptical, and eventually you can start a carefully planned walk-to-jog program. By week 10 or so, you're actually programming real structured running intervals to get them truly game fit. But how do you know if the knee is handling the running? Here is a super simple but incredibly powerful tool, the 24-hour rule. Look, it's totally normal for a little bit of swelling to show up after a run. If that swelling is gone within 24 hours, that's an acceptable response. You're good. But if it sticks around for longer than that, that's a problem response. And that's your cue to back off on the running volume. Simple as that. Okay, we've covered a lot. Lateral movement, smart loading, cardio. Now let's see how all these pieces come together in a real-world, week-by-week blueprint for this whole middle phase. So this first block from week 6 to 9, this is all about building the foundation. The main focus is hypertrophy, basically increasing muscle size and making the tissues more tolerant to load. We're using really controlled movements like box squats and single leg presses, often with a slow tempo to maximize that time under tension. You might also see something like a BFR protocol here. That's blood flow restriction, a cool technique to get muscle growth with lighter weights. In the second block, you'll see the emphasis starts to shift. We're moving from just building size to building real, honest-to-goodness strength. We're increasing the intensity with things like full-depth squats. We also start prepping the body for the impact of running with exercises like double-leg pogos, which are a great little test for readiness. And we kick off that walk-to-jog protocol we just talked about. And this final block is really the bridge to performance. This is where we start to develop power, using heavier compound lifts in those lower rep ranges. We also bring in more sport-specific plyometrics like single-leg hops and those reactive shuffles, which really challenge the athlete to handle unpredictable movements, just like they would in a game. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? The most crucial point is that this whole process, it's not about a timeline. It is a systematic, criteria-based journey. Every single progression has to be earned by hitting specific goals for strength, control, and how the tissue is tolerating the load. This is exactly how we bridge that gap from the therapy table back to high performance, both safely and effectively. So that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Whether you're a clinician working with athletes, or maybe you're an athlete going through this yourself, how can you apply this criteria-driven approach? How can you use these ideas to move beyond just healing and really start rebuilding those robust, resilient qualities you need to not just get back to your sport, but to actually thrive when you get there?